Like we talked a bit about in the program guidelines, the ripple is a movement that it depends less on your ability to push through any kind of burn or anything like that. And it is more dependent on your mental effort. It is a movement that should be treated less like an exercise and more like a skill. The skill that we're trying to build is both a specific one and a general one. The specific skill is, you become better at whatever you're trying to do. So if you try to learn how to perform a spinal wave, then that is a skill that you build. But the general skill that we want to improve is our body awareness. One thing to keep in mind when we're trying to improve our body awareness is that there is, unfortunately, no direct link between our brains and the body part that we want to communicate with. There's a filter in between, and that filter is something we can call the body map. Now, in the body map, every body part is represented. However, some body parts are less prioritized because of biology. Like, as an example, our hands and our tongues are very well represented in these body maps because the movement we perform with these two body parts are so complex. And some body parts are less developed because of how we choose to use them. So, as an example, let's say that I were to tape two of my fingers together, and I no longer could move these fingers as two individual fingers. I had to move them as a whole or as one. What would ultimately happen is that because of how I was using my fingers, the two different fingers in the body map would kind of fuse into being one, or at least one of them would become very under prioritized. Let's put it that way. And the same thing can happen when we move our spines as well. If we decide to stop moving our spines in a certain way, I'm looking at you, fitness industry, then that will ultimately cause the different representations in the body map to be fused into being one, or at least being very muddled and unclear and underdeveloped. And that's why a lot of us struggle with certain types of movements. It's not because we lack the strength. It's not because we have poor mobility. It is because these different body parts aren't that well represented in our body maps. That being said, let's take a look at the first ripple exercise, the standing pelvic rock. As you can see in this frame, I have pulled up my shirt, and this is not something that you have to do. I am doing it for practical reasons. I'm doing it to show you my waistband. And the reason I want to show you my waistband is so that you can see the two different positions that we want to end up in, the posterior pelvic tilt and the anterior pelvic tilt. We'll start off with the posterior pelvic tilt. In the posterior pelvic tilt, our goal is to pull the front of our pants up towards our belly button. And in the anterior pelvic tilt, we're trying to do the opposite. The back of the pants are being pulled up. One thing you can do to better experience whether or not you're in a posterior or anterior pelvic tilt is to place your thumbs on your stomach and your fingers on your pants. Now, if you are in a posterior pelvic tilt, like in this picture or this frame, the distance between the fingers and the thumb should diminish. Once you go into an anterior pelvic tilt, that distance should increase. Now, what I'm trying to do as I'm practicing this is to, yes, get a greater range of motion. I want to, release as much movement as possible, but I'm also trying to make sure that the path or the way from one end range of motion to the other one pelvic tilt to the other one, is as smooth as possible. one thing you often will experience when you're trying a new movement is, this kind of jittery, funky sensation. This is something that we want. If we never experience that jittery, funky feeling, it means that we aren't really learning anything new. But we want to make sure that this feeling gets lessened. We want the feeling to become smoother after some time. So after we've done the standing pelvic rocks in an upright position, we're going to lean forward. And I'm placing my hands on my knees here simply because that will allow me to be a bit more stable. And here, going into anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. And again, making sure that the movement isn't only, we're not only going into extreme end ranges of motion, we're also making the movement smoother. After doing it bent over, we're going to do it in a lean back position. In the lean back position, you will have to bend the knees a bit. If you don't, you will probably fall over. Because one thing you have to try to do here is to make sure that your shoulders are somewhat behind your feet. And without bending the knees, shoulders behind feet equals falling. Don't fall. Here, we're going to do the same thing into posterior and anterior pelvic tilt while maintaining the position of the shoulders. And that is your first ripple exercise.